just to kickstart, I'm Pip Jones. I live on the Queensland-New South Wales border, just outside a little town called Gundawindi, which I call the centre of the universe, yet to be disputed. So if you've got a town you think is the centre of the universe, I'd love to hear about it. I was lucky enough in late 2023 to be awarded a Nuffield Scholarship, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, but in case you're not, it's an experiential leadership program where scholars are awarded funding. So I was awarded $35,000 to travel internationally to try and understand agriculture globally, but also specifically looking at my topic, which is tracking carbon on farm good for business, which you can imagine is not a nice little tiny succinct topic. That it's quite complex, it's contentious, and it is, I could have gone anywhere in the world and still taken away some learning. So anyway, I will take you through what I tried to understand and what some of my learnings were, and I'd love some of your feedback as well, because I obviously, yes, I've seen what's happening overseas, but I'm not an expert on this stuff. I only know what I've understood, and I think as well what I've learned isn't anything new. It's nothing groundbreaking. It's something that we're probably all experiencing as we work in extension and advisory roles across Australia and globally as well, which I think is sometimes heartening, but also sometimes a bit worrying when we look at this topic. So I will get started and hopefully technology will work. So I was looking at, is tracking carbon on farm good for business? But I was also interested in who was supporting farmers to do this. So in Australia, we've got NRM groups nationally. We've also got government agencies. We've got the CSIRO, we've got MLA, we've got all grain growers, a whole lot of organisations that are trying to help distill information and extend it to improve adoption and understanding and education amongst farmers. So I was interested to see what was happening around the world. I also was a little, I went in thinking, well, we've got the ACCU scheme in Australia. We've got the government initiative and the government program that sort of governs how carbon credits are developed and issued and sold in Australia. Obviously, every other country in the world would have the same thing. Turns out it doesn't. We are quite unique in our carbon market in Australia, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But what I did discover is that generally, internationally, no different to in Australia, farmers are either engaging through carbon markets or they're engaging by measuring their carbon footprint on their farm and then using that information to help inform decision making and improve that carbon footprint, but also improve their profitability and productivity, which sort of go hand in hand. I'll start with some of the carbon markets. The first place I wanted to go when I started researching was Canada, because they have the Alberta Emissions Offset Scheme. If you've ever been to Alberta, you'll know that the landscape is just dotted with oil and gas rigs, which form a huge part of the economy of that province. So in order to offset the emissions of the oil and gas industry, in 2008, the Alberta provincial government established the emissions offset scheme. So quite similar in concept to the Australian one. There are a bunch of methodologies that farmers can enter into projects for in order to be issued and trade in carbon credits. Obviously, 2008, it was quite an early form of a carbon market, so it definitely wasn't perfect. Similarly to Australia, they've sort of had methodologies where they've retired certain methodologies or they've reviewed them to improve them. Probably early on, from what I understand, there might have been junk credits sold, so carbon credits that are issued without actually carbon being sequestered or emissions reduced. So probably similar challenges to probably what we've seen in Australia, and sometimes it wasn't always as beneficial for the farmer as it initially seemed. However, like Australia, they're improving the models that they use every year. They're still undertaking projects. I didn't meet people who had actually done projects recently, but I had spoken with I guess it would be like a service provider who had initially engaged with farmers on that project years ago. So that was really interesting, the fact that, like Australia, Alberta had a government-led carbon market. The USA doesn't have such a market. So what in the USA, the ranches that I visited used international methods like the Vera, Climate Action Reserve, or Gold Standard to enter into agreements, which was for the ones that I visited was where they were doing high density, high rotation, long rest grazing. And I guess bringing it back to my question about is it good for business, the reason that farmers over there, the ranchers in the States, looked at it as being a good business decision is obviously they have the off-farm income, but also by doing high density, high rotation, long rest grazing, they're improving ground cover, which in turn was improving soil health and improving profitability and productivity as the end game. So for them, it made sense for them to be involved in those projects. I visited Vietnam as well, where the government wants to connect to a global voluntary carbon market by 2028. Vietnam has no carbon market at the moment. It's very new to farmers and to their advisors. So I went over with a bunch of Australian researchers from ACR, which is the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, who were working on a project, and part of that project was called Carbon in Focus. So it was about informing farmers and their advisors with science-led research that meant that if and when carbon markets came into Vietnam, they would benefit the farmers, as opposed to farmers and their advisors within the Department of Agriculture having no idea what's going on, but hearing and seeing and being given these opportunities that look too good to be true and possibly might have been. So in Vietnam, I was in the Mekong Delta, and in that part of the world, your average rice farm, which is the main farm, is 1 hectare in size. So for them, emissions from those rice farms is where the biggest emissions in agriculture are. And so for them, it was around education and capacity building and looking at the potential to reduce emissions on those rice farms through residue management and a few other bits and pieces. But a really interesting place to visit. Part of my visit there, we went and had the researchers from the Australian University, the Australian researchers and the Vietnamese university researchers held a carbon forum for all of the Department of Agriculture staff and other advisors to come, and presentations were given and discussions were had, and the questions that were coming from the floor of advisors to the researchers were exactly the same as probably the questions that we see coming from farmers around how much does it cost to be involved, how much money can I make, how much of a percentage does a service provider keep if they do a carbon project on my farm, so completely different context, different climate, different socioeconomic status, different businesses and industry to what I know. But the questions coming from farmers and the concerns coming from farmers, as well as what the opportunities are exactly the same. So then the other part of it, what I looked into was measuring and managing carbon footprints and whether that was good for business. In Canada, the federal Canadian government has over 4 years, from 2021 to 2024, invested 700 million Canadian dollars in what they call the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, where farmers could apply for incentives, so funding, to either use infrastructure to improve rotational grazing or implement rotational grazing, to reduce nitrous oxide emissions through nitrogen and fertiliser management, and by implementing cover cropping. So I visited a farmer on Prince Edward Island, which is Anne and Green Gables country, who had applied for funding to do just that. So obviously without that funding, this wouldn't be a priority for her and she wouldn't be able to do it. But with the funding, which covered up to 85% of the project costs, she could improve her grazing. So those cattle on that slide are from her place, and behind her you can see the single wire fence that she uses to manage the grazing. And from doing that, she's got better ground cover, better soil health, and is able to manage her farm in a more financially viable way by using government incentives that then the government uses the data that they are able to collect from her farm to prove that they are working towards supporting farmers in emissions reductions. And Perry Farms was a potato farm in Alberta where they report directly to McCain and Frito-Lay their scope 1 and 2 emissions. They get no price premium at the moment to do that. However, they think that by doing that, they will in the future have preferential treatment and market access that might give them a better deal than, let's say, the neighbours or the other people that don't provide that data. They also do extensive soil testing so that some years they don't have to use fertilisers because they understand where they're sitting from the soil test point of view and looking at also their soil organic carbon and how that's improving. So that was a really interesting one. Interestingly, they use the Cool Farms tool, which is a European model, to support that, which I'm not sure how the fact that it's a Canadian system, but using a European tool would skew the results or make any difference. Interestingly, there's 82 different carbon calculators globally that exist. And the interesting thing is as well, if you put the same data into different tools, it will spit out different answers. So they're all sort of use slightly different metrics or ways of working that I don't understand. But there is a really cool OECD paper. It's quite long, but it goes into some of that detail about how the carbon calculators are used and also formulated, and how those differences in what they prioritise, I guess, can have different outcomes. So in the UK, I met a consultant who worked for consulting to a couple of big processors. One was called Dawn Dumbia, a meat processor, and the other was Arla Organic Dairy. There was a pilot program, but she worked with farmers to work out their on-farm emissions or their on-farm carbon footprint, and then as part of that as well would then be able to support the farmer by recognising where the gaps are in their business and where the efficiencies can be made. So it might be looking at feed to energy conversions and where can we make improvements there, or it might be longevity of the cattle herd, or it might be manure management. So yes, the processors were paying for that. It wasn't a farmer cost, and it was only a pilot. I think 500 meat processors, meat farmers, beef farmers with Dawn Dumbia, and 1,200 organic dairies that Arla used. But in doing that, the farmers had a better grasp of their data, and year on year could then make better decisions to improve the profitability of their farm. So, and at no extra cost to them other than their time. And then went to a big cattle farm in the USA called Matador Ranch. They had done an Asparagopsis trial a few years ago. They said there was no impact on productivity from the trial. It was a very small trial in grazing herd, but they did see a reduction in methane emissions from that herd. But Asparagopsis is costly for one thing, but it's also, I have also spoken with dairy farmers where it can impact I think it's the iodine level in milk, which impacts then cheese making. I'm not a dairy person, so you have to excuse me on some of the detail. And the other thing is that it was Asparagopsis was a appetite suppressant in another dairy herd. So once it got to a specific level in the feed ratio, it was an appetite suppression, so cattle are losing weight. So not something that's actually going to be good for profitability and productivity of your dairy herd. I headed to Uruguay in just south of Brazil, where there are no net zero targets. However, the government applies for loans for programs, agricultural programs, through the World Bank. And at the time, the government were pulling together a program that said, we want to help farmers by making efficiencies in their production systems and also improve ground cover through grazing management. And in production efficiencies might be preg testing your cows and culling the empties, or improving your weaning rates, and those sorts of activities. And they wanted to do that through extension, but also a grants program. And the reason they were, not the sole reason, but one of the reasons they were sort of focusing on efficiencies and improving ground cover and soil health and sequestering carbon and also reducing emissions through those efficiencies was because, despite having no net zero targets, they had signed up to the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement requires you to have nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, in place that say, yes, we will work towards the Paris Agreement of reducing our global warming by 1.5 degrees. However, and these are the activities that we will try and do to get there. And so the World Bank would give them a discount on their loan if they were able to show that they were working towards their nationally determined contributions, which I thought was a really interesting concept that I'd not come across before. But also, it's also about making sure that your farmers are productive, and that you're valuing biodiversity. So they were very clear on the fact that they said we aren't reducing carbon at whatever cost. We value our water, we value our biodiversity, and so for us, it's also about balancing those things. I visited a carbon neutral beef farm there, where they have, I think, 10,000 cattle that they join every year, and they have been able to improve preg testing, improve weaning rates, and improve their stocking rates over the last few years by using rotational grazing. But also they have been able to be certified as carbon neutral through a standard that I can't say how much rigor was in the standard, but they've got carbon neutral status, and with that status comes the ability to sell 5% of their meat at a premium to Switzerland. The rest goes to China, but 5% of that at a price premium, because of that carbon neutral status, can be sent to Switzerland, and the Swiss people can eat carbon neutral Uruguayan beef. So, and Vietnam does have a net zero target by 2050, like Australia. 1 hectare rice farms is the average. So I can imagine that is quite an ambitious goal, but I mean, they will have a plan on how they will work towards that goal, I guess. The government will. There is a national government policy called 1 million hectares of low emissions sustainable rice. So in places like Vietnam, the government is driving policy that will look at low emissions agriculture and how farmers can engage in that space to meet government and global expectations around net zero targets and meeting the Paris Agreement. So it definitely is a global issue. So I just listed here some of the attitudes that I came across when I was travelling, and if you have a look at those, you'll see that it is actually no different to probably a lot of the attitudes that Australian farmers have. I met a UK beef farmer who had 10 years of carbon accounts through various government and industry initiatives that they had been involved with. And through that knowledge of having 10 years worth of data, they could make decisions on when or when not to, for example, buy fertiliser, because they could see when it made sense for them to do it from a business point of view, because they had that data and that long-term visibility. That person also said to me, though, they said, Pip, you can't throw stones from the outside, so it's better to be involved and understand the process and then be able to critique it than to sit on the outside and do nothing and just throw stones and say it's all a load of garbage. So, yeah, it's an interesting when you start looking globally, what are the attitudes? It's not that different to Australia. So I was trying to understand, to really distill it down, what's the why? So obviously, if you're in a carbon market, you are looking at an alternative income, you're looking at improving your soil health, you're looking at improving your biodiversity, and then obviously your productivity and your profitability. And if you're measuring your carbon footprint, sometimes it's about a price premium, sometimes it's about market access, sometimes it's just about supply chain pressure, which I know as of July this year, the dairy processors, the milk companies, are going to have to start reporting their Scope 3 emissions. So that pressure is coming down to farmers. However, there is no mandate for farmers to have to provide individual data on farm, from what I understand. But it's also about understand your emissions so that you can make informed decision making and you can identify gaps and then the efficiencies that you can be made from having that data. And it came down to, I guess, what are the motivations? So globally, I feel like the motivations were all motivated by money. We are motivated by time. So when I talk about time, it's time to actually do something. So time to put up a fence, or time to baseline your soil carbon, let's say, but also the time that it takes to get a return from that investment. And I think if you're in a wealthy country like Australia, the UK, Canada, North America, you are often motivated by sustainability. I think in countries like Borneo or Vietnam, sustainability probably isn't top of your list of why you do things. It's more about putting food on the table and being able to feed your family and keep doing what you're doing. But I feel like the enablers and the barriers globally are all around the policies. It's around the frameworks and the models that are in place in each country. Climate's obviously going to impact what people and governments can and can't do. The history of a country and also the culture, and whether or not they are able to get engaged, but also whether they have the want to get engaged as well. Another thing I've come across in my journeys is always considering the trade-offs. So that's where the benefits gained do not outweigh the effort that you put in. So don't outweigh the cost. So on our farm, for example, a few years ago, we were looking at doing a soil carbon project through a service provider. At the time, the cost to baseline for that was not worth it for our farm. It was going to cost too much, and the returns from carbon credits, it was not worth it for us, so we didn't do it. However, that doesn't stop us using rotational grazing and using water and wire to manage how we graze and doing soil testing, because we can see the benefits of doing that, because we're getting improved soil health and improved productivity and better carrying capacity that goes with that. So I guess it's always about understanding that carbon is great, or understanding carbon footprints or carbon farming is fantastic, but always for farmers to adopt it, it needs to relate back to the viability of the business and productivity and profitability. So I've just got some takeaways there. So record what you're already doing on farm to reduce emissions. So a lot of the time people are already pre-testing or increasing weaning rates or using precision agriculture to measure or manage how much chemical or fertiliser you put on a farm, and a whole bunch of other things, planting trees, etc., etc. So if you're recording what you're already doing, even if you don't have all the data, just by understanding what those activities are, it's a good place to start. Progress over perfection. I stole that line from Susan Orgel, who's the scientist, soil scientist many of you might have come across. She was one of the researchers I headed to Vietnam with. So I spent a week with Suze. And that is one of her lines, and I think it's a really good one. If we wait for perfection, we're never going to get anything done. And also, if everything was perfect in the world, it would be a pretty boring place. So let's just try and aim for progress. Reducing emissions or storing carbon can increase profitability and efficiencies on farm. There's no silver bullet, and stacking actions is quite really the only way that you can meaningfully reduce emissions while still having a profitable business. And context is key. So what works for me on my farm might not work for the neighbours, because we've all got different risk appetites. We've got motivations, succession plans, business structures, climate, soils, the list goes on. So there's no one size fits all, which I think you guys already know. So that's about it, I think, Rachel. I have a really fun, when I'm in person, I've done a little fun activity, but it's a bit hard to do it on the computer.
Oh, gosh, what a teaser.
I can try. Well, it's not a fun activity, let's face it, but it's interactive. I can try and do it.
Okay.
If everyone, and I don't know how we'll get it. I might have to stop sharing my screen so we can see more people. Because it's, okay. So what I need everyone to do is put their virtual hand up, please.
Their virtual hand.
Virtual
okay. So
hand
their
up.
yellow hand.
Yellow hand. Everyone
it's at the bottom. Yep.
Hand up.
I don't have one. I'm sorry. Can I just do that?
Yes. Or do this. Let's do yes.
You don't have a yellow hand.
I don't have a yellow hand. I don't know why.
So I am going to say, so if you have either a property or keep your hand up if you have a farm or you've got really good knowledge of someone you know who runs a farm, so keep your hand up. If you don't sort of have that sort of knowledge, put your hand down. So we've got some hands up still. Great. Okay, I've got a few to play with still. All right, so put your hand down. So my challenge is that I have every hand down by the end of this little session. And this is something that you guys, if you're doing work with farmers on this sort of topic, this is a really easy way that I thought of when I was driving down the highway one day, that would be to just engage farmers in how they are already doing stuff. So put your hand down if you or the person you're representing with your hand up is a beef producer and they peg test cattle, and with that they then cull their empty cows. So they're using actions to help manage how they do things. So we've still got hands up? Yep, okay, great. Hand up if you're a trader and your aim as a beef or sheep trader is to put weight on your animals so you can turn them off early, as early as possible.
Hang on, so we're putting our hands down if we do
hands
that?
Down if you are doing those. So I'm looking for, by the end of it, I've got a few hands up still. Okay, hands down if you use soil tests to help you inform decision making on farm. Hands down if you use genetics, so EBVs, to selectively buy bulls or females for your breeding herd. So whether that's using gestation or weight gain at 200 days or a whole range of other ones. I've still got 3 hands up. This isn't good. Hands down if you've planted trees on your farm before. Bruce, you've got 1 left. Hands down if you I had a cropper and you use, have I used that question already? Precision fertilizer, precision ag so if you're a crop intercropping and you use technology to reduce chemical or fertilizer. Great. All right, so all the hands are down. So it's much easier in person, believe me. You get everyone to stand up and everyone sits down. And by the end of it, the idea is that you guys might think that you are not engaged in this low emissions, understanding emissions or reducing emissions or sequestering carbon on your farm. But by doing this and sitting down, you're showing that actually you are engaging. You just need to probably start thinking about what you're doing and how that can not only reduce your carbon footprint on farm, but it also, the reason you do it isn't for that, it's because you reduce, it improves your profitability and productivity as a farm business, because you do it because it's good for business. So sorry if that last little bit was a bit confusing. I didn't know whether to try it or not, but anyway, hopefully you got the idea.
I think it's good. I think it's a good activity, Pip, and it's nice actually to bring a sort of facilitation, learning to the group. Thanks.
I don't know, you guys might all be like, we are never using that ever. Terrible.
I think it'd work well in person. And I was thinking about that. I mean, some of the CFOP guys might already be doing that, or some of you other guys that are doing sort of workshops and things out in the world around carbon farming. That was great, Pip. Thanks so much. Who has got a question for Pip about her work and project, or even just about where was the most beautiful place you went? Because I think that you might have allocated your tour.
I was very, very conscious that I had visited lots of very beautiful places in the world, but that was not the main aim of going there. Mm-hmm. It just was helpful.
Yeah, great. One of the questions I wanted to ask, I'll get the party started, is around what proportion of people do you feel were achieving that you spoke to, or what was the vibe around how many people were contributing to biodiversity gains through the carbon, emissions reduction or carbon storage work they were doing? I mean, you said it wasn't a key driver, but in most cases,
on the country. So when I was in Montana, biodiversity was fairly, the ranchers I talked to, that was fairly important for them. And similarly in the UK, biodiversity was an important part of how they do business. However, it's important to note that the UK has a program called the Sustainable Farming Incentive, and that incentivises farmers to do nature-based activities on farm, such as planting a hedgerow or leaving a buffer strip for beneficial insects or doing a soil management plan. And if they do those, they can get paid a per hectare rate. But the sideline to that is pretty sure that project was so oversubscribed that in March they basically said we aren't taking any more applications this year, because from what I understand, the budget was completely committed. So I think biodiversity, and it kind of links to that sustainability motivation piece, it's that if you can afford for biodiversity to be important, it is. And again, if your government policies support that as well. But also I saw a very small part of, I didn't go to Texas, I didn't go to the Midwest. I was in Montana, which is Rocky Mountains, a lot of regenerative agriculture practiced. So very, very aware that I was seeing a select group.
Thanks, Pip. Yeah, very interesting. Who has got the next question?
I've got a question. Sorry about my non-virtual hand. Thanks, Pip. That was super interesting, and I'm super jealous looking at those photos, but also hearing about what you actually got to go out and talk about. That's super cool. My question, I guess, comes from my MP frame, I guess, but I'm interested to hear more about the support networks and the trusted advisor stuff, I guess, that you guys are all filling out there, and it's such a critical part of it, and who might be filling those gaps either currently or what you see might be happening in the future when these markets are established in the various how are they getting their trusted advice, I guess, to
how are they getting And one thing I found that there wasn't any consistency globally on who people get their trusted advice from. In the States, the example I saw was essentially like a land care group. In Montana, people relied heavily on that group for advice and information. and the Department of Natural Resources, who organised a couple of events that I went to. A Gay Brown event happened to be on when I was there, so I went to that, and they seem to be quite trusted. It really depends. It's very sort of context. I feel like I use that word a lot, but it's really valid because at the end of my report, and I didn't put it in this presentation, but at the end of my report, I did a really quick and dirty, like, here are the different kinds of models of engagement I saw. Here are some examples, and here are some of the pros and cons. Like, it isn't perfect, and I'm happy to be corrected on some of it if you disagree. But it's more about sometimes it's a research program like the Vietnamese model with the Carbon in Focus program, or like the Net Zero Ag CRC in Australia, or like New South Wales DPI RD have their research programs about low methane pastures. And then in some places it's one-on-one training. Some places it's consultants being paid by the processors. Sometimes it's paid training, and it really varies. And just there's no consistency that I could see that sort of there's one country doing a really good job, except my takeaway is that actually there's a lot of opportunities in Australia for farmers to understand this stuff and engage. So we don't need to travel overseas. I'm glad I did, but my takeaway is that actually Australia is doing a pretty good job, and we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves.
Thanks, Pip.
Thanks, Pip. I think Carla and then Tibby.
Thank you. My question was just about motivations for farmers. So in addition to obviously better productivity, better yields, etc., from doing that work, what was the sentiment around farmers' sort of beliefs or trust in getting a product price premium as compared, which is like a carrot approach, as opposed to the incentive of just maintaining market access, which is really more, I would see that more as a business requirement, whereas sort of being promised or convinced that there might be a price premium or a cheaper interest rate is a different incentive.
So you're sort of saying sorry, just to clarify, is it sort of
I guess just what was the sense, like with different countries that you visited, were people believing that they would get that premium, or were they at the bottom line really about market access?
Yeah. I think in developed countries like the UK, which is very used to administration that goes around agriculture, we've all watched Clarkson's Farm, I'm sure, and we understand what they need to do there. So I feel like, and I think the expectations from the supply chain in the UK and EU, I didn't spend a lot of time in the EU, but the expectations from the supply chain are a lot higher, and they're a lot more advanced. So that whilst there are some price premiums that come, I feel like it's just an expectation that it's just what you do, and we aren't there yet. And I think, and this is me just making assumptions, maybe in some other parts of the world, people will take what they can get. So if you can have a carbon neutral beef, and you can make a profit from that, you will take it until social pressure or social license or something else comes along, or regulation, and says actually that's not good enough, and so you can't do it. So that's just an observation of mine, I wonder if things like climate-related financial disclosure and a whole lot of other incoming requirements, whether that's the EU deforestation in the future or whatever it would be, will actually impact how the expectations we have over market access or price premiums or preferential treatment. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question well, but it's complex.
It is complex. Yeah, but thank you.
Thanks, Pippa. Thanks, Carla. Tibby.
Thanks, Pippa. That was really interesting, and I'm jealous of your travels.
Everyone's going to be applying for Nuffield scholarships now. It'll be flooded with NRMs.
So cool. I just wanted to ask, I was kind of thinking about maybe because I think we've actually got the first environmental market here in Australia, but were you talking to farmers about that versus carbon projects? And cause I feel like farmers over here are a little bit more wary of carbon projects because there's a lot of paperwork and commitment and the opportunity to look more into those co-benefits and what you get from that. And if farmers around the world were a little bit more interested in that and what they were getting offered and their motivations in that space.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I usually include it in the presentation, but I didn't today. So I talked about the sustainable farming incentive from the UK, and someone actually said to me from the UK, why would we go with a carbon market? So they've only got two, the peatland code and the woodland restoration code. They said, why would we go with that when it's much easier to go through the sustainable farming incentive and get paid per hectare than jump through the hoops of the carbon market? But again, I think in other parts of the world, maybe, again, this is an assumption I'm making, but in Vietnam, for example, where those sorts of opportunities, they might exist, but again, I don't know how much rigour or integrity some of those programs have. And so maybe the easier option is to do a carbon project, because if you've got some international company coming in saying, if we got a deal for you, you can do a soil carbon project or you can do that, then you don't know what you don't know, right? So if you don't know to ask the questions or look at what are the other options, then maybe that will sort of skew how you respond.
Did you talk to anyone about natural capital? Like, was that language used overseas?
A bit. A couple of the Montana farmers I went to visit were really, they had done lots of biodiversity surveys and bird surveys on farm. One of them, they weren't really using that though as a tradable commodity, or they weren't using a metric to help sort of to value it properly. One of them was a bison producer, and if he had farm visits, he would often talk about the biodiversity. So from a tourism point of view, yes, but not from a actual natural capital value. Yeah, but I didn't really. I mean, in the UK, environmental outcomes are fairly a part of policy almost, or a lot more than in Australia. So it's like people get paid to not graze paddocks because they can breed birds there, and they get a lot more money from doing that than they do from putting cattle on there, or they used to, but then the cattle prices went through the roof, and so now that's switched. And so really, in that situation, it's almost like a supply and demand, and where they're going to get the most, who's going to give them the most money for that part of land, and depending on what they do with it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Not sure if that's a great answer, but yeah.
Thanks, Pip, and thanks for the question, Tibby. No, that was really interesting. James, we'll take your question, and that'll be the last one. So please go for it. You've been patiently waiting. So
I'll keep it brief. Thanks. Thanks, Pippa. I really like your commercial context and your assessment of the drivers that landholders are experiencing and what's motivating them. I guess one of the questions I have is that we are in the carbon space partly because it's relatively easy to measure. Did you see, for all the investment and incentives and market pressures, did you see significant landscape improvement? So transition of landscapes to a much either healthier space or a more protected space or a more resilient space?
I just trying to think. I did in the States when I visited Montana, but the drivers for that were equally, if not more, because of wanting to implement regenerative agriculture practices.
From a brand perspective as well?
Say again?
From a brand perspective?
Probably, I think it was, from a brand perspective in the States, definitely. I'm just trying to think in Uruguay with the carbon neutral beef, they were definitely pushing the carbon neutral beef brand that they had. However, equally, it was about sustainability.
Yeah.
So, and I think more so.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing the same in Australia.
Yeah.
Just a quick sub-question. Were you able to translate the environments that you saw into more drought-prone regions that we see in Australia?
Canada probably was, and Uruguay. Oh, well, no, not even Uruguay. Canada was probably the closest to a drought-prone.
Yeah.
Not so much because in Canada, for example, I'll use an example, they have insurance, which is if you get crop insurance, you get the state government or the provincial government, the national government, and you put into your insurance bucket. And so if you have a bad year, that insurance tops up what you didn't make in your yield. So if you lose 50% yield because it's too dry, insurance covers the rest.
Yeah.
So I feel like
massive other incentives,
Yeah, so it was probably, again, that's where the policies that are in place can sort of skew or change the responses, perhaps.
Thanks for that. And congratulations on a really thoughtful approach to your scholarship.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. I don't know. And I like I said, I probably don't know any more than a lot of you guys. I've just had the pleasure of being able to have a look at a tiny part of what's happening around the world. So,
That was great. Thanks, Pippa. And is your report available now?
It is available. I'm always a little scared to say it's available. Yes.
Do you want to put the link? Have you got a link for it? You can chuck it in the chat if you like.
I will do
That would
that.
be wonderful.